Hey guys, Nathan here again, Absurd Being. We're up to number 11 with this series on Kierkegaard. Probably going to go to probably got another 7 maybe, 7-ish videos to go. So just to give you a feel for where we're at. This video is going to be a little bit different. I'm not going to go to that diagram. We're still in the 3 spheres of existence. This is the 5th video that we're spending on the 3 spheres, and there'll be one more after this where we look at God. And then we'll move on to talk about some other things, sin and repentance and stuff like that. So anyway, that's kind of the layout of the land, if you like, the lay of the land. And but in this video, I just want to go through a couple of kind of case studies that Kierkegaard gives us regarding faith and also regarding faith connected to the religious sphere of existence, and also includes, obviously, given that it's connected to faith, it includes include the paradox and the absolute relationship and all that kind of stuff that we've talked about. So a couple of good case studies that Kierkegaard offers concerning faith, just to see how this stuff actually works in real life. Well, real-ish life, I guess. So the first one is we're going to look at the story in Fear and Trembling of how Abraham sacrifices his son. Alright, so in Fear and Trembling, basically the whole book it's not very long, it's definitely worth reading. The whole book basically is a defense of Abraham. Why did Abraham agree to sacrifice his son Isaac? And it's basically Kierkegaard just trying to flesh out, Abraham is kind of the exemplar for faith in Christianity. But how could this be if his faith led him to sacrifice his child, which seems like an abominable action, right? So why does Abraham deserve to be praised for his faith in light of his actions? That's the whole book. That's all he talks about in Fear and Trembling. So let's just have a look at this, how Kierkegaard gets around this. So Abraham, first of all, in a nutshell, Abraham's faith was not that he believed in God and nothing else, or he was just doing God's will. Rather, he had faith that after having sacrificed Isaac, he would get him back. Not when he dies and goes to heaven and they're reunited in heaven or anything like that, but in his lifetime. He had faith. Abraham had faith that somehow God would arrange it so that after giving up his son, after sacrificing his son, he would get him back in this life. Despite the fact that that's patently impossible, it's absurd, but that's the faith that Kierkegaard's defending. And not that he will sacrifice his son and it's for the greater good, or God's telling him to do it, so it must work out well in some way. His faith is specifically that after giving up Isaac, after sacrificing him, he'll get him back somehow in his lifetime, in this life, not in heaven or anything like that. So that's kind of the premise. Well, it's not the premise, that's the answer. That's the answer. But how does he get there? Let's just have a look at that. So Abraham's faith, this faith that he has that he'll get his son back despite sacrificing him, he achieves with a double movement, what Kierkegaard calls the double movement. And the first movement here is infinite resignation, the movement of infinite resignation. And in this move, the individual completely renounces whatever it is that they're giving up, the earthly desire that they have. In Abraham's case, to spend his life with his son. He's giving up that. And so it's a complete renunciation. It's not, and therefore it requires passion, not reflection. This isn't a calculation. It's not something that you can contemplate and reason your way into. This requires pure passion to give up, to renounce whatever it is that you value so highly. And so this, however, this is not a renounce it, give it up, forget about it and move on. So that's not, there's nothing infinite about that for Kierkegaard. That's, it's, you wanted something, you stopped wanting it here, you renounced it, and you moved on. And that desire kind of has faded. The infinite resignation, it's infinite in the sense that it's not just a forgetting and moving on. In fact, you never move on. And Kierkegaard says the desire itself is never given up. So even though you renounce the achievement, you renounce the possibility of ever having your desire, the desire itself never goes away, and that's the infinite aspect of it. So there's no sorrow or pining in this, though. There's rather, actually, Kierkegaard says it bestows peace and repose on the person, the individual, whom he calls the night of infinite resignation. So this person has given up, renounced the receiving whatever it is or accomplishing whatever it is that they want in life, and this has kind of grants them a kind of peace, a kind of air of tranquility. And in a nice phrase he says this individual, this night of infinite resignation, has become reconciled to existence, which I quite like. I quite like that. Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of something else. But anyway, he's reconciled him or herself to existence, and because of this, they have a kind of an air of tranquility or peace, and this person appears different to other people. So the having completed this movement, this infinite resignation, other people can see there's something special about about this guy or this woman. So there's a kind of an air about them that's different. However, such an individual is incapable of true joy, having lost that desire or the possibility of achieving that desire. They've also lost the capacity for true joy. So that's the first movement, infinite resignation. Now, none of this is really related as such to the schema, the three spheres of existence. It's not about relating to relative ends relatively and absolute ends absolutely and all of that kind of thing. Rather, this is more, like I said, it's kind of a case study, a specific situation. And it's a situation in which the goal that the individual has turns out to be unachievable, unattainable in some way. And we'll see that faith will come into this a little bit later, but it's not explicitly like you can't put this infinite resignation somewhere in the three spheres of existence. It's not really, it doesn't fit into the schema like that, I think. It's taking kind of the whole idea of those three spheres, and faith in particular, and applying it to a specific situation. And the situation is, like I say, the goal turns out to be unattainable. So that's the first movement, infinite resignation. The second movement is the movement of faith. And this is, in this movement, what one has faith that what one has renounced will nevertheless be given back. And that faith, because it's impossible, and you've renounced it as impossible, it is 100% cannot happen. So that faith can only be faith on the strength of the absurd. And that's what characterises the second movement, is its appeal to the absurd. So the initial desire was renounced in human terms, but recaptured because through God all things are possible. And it's this appeal to God that lets that faith in what is impossible, what is actually absurd. That's what allows that faith to be preserved in the individual. So the absurd, just to drill the point home, the absurd is not the unpredictable, the improbable, the unexpected, or the unforeseen. All of these terms apply to the finite, the earthly realm, where, remember, the desire remains completely impossible, completely unattainable. There's no realistic chance of this happening. And that's the case for Abraham. He was going to sacrifice his son. There's no way he could get his son back. So his faith that he would get his son back was rested on the strength of the absurd, on the belief that for God, somehow, all things are possible. So it's an absurd belief, which obviously connects back to the last video. So the absurd operates in the realm of the infinite, or the realm of the spiritual, where all things are possible. So this individual is the knight of faith, in the same way that in the first movement we had the knight of infinite resignation. And this individual doesn't appear different from others. So this is an important distinction between the two. In the first, remember, the Knight of Infinite Resignation looks different. They have an air about them. But the Knight of Faith doesn't appear different. You can't tell that you're in front of a Knight of Faith, if you in fact are. There's no outward manifestation of that. There's no outward indicator. And that dovetails in with what we've talked about before with subjectivity, or it's the inwardness. Nothing manifests on the outside, and deception. So this all links back to that. And remember, the Knight of Infinite Resignation was incapable of true joy. The Knight of Faith, however, is capable of true joy because they have this faith that rests on the absurd. So this characterization of the absurd is, again, the absurd in a specific instance, in a specific situation. The way we talked about the absurd in the last video was kind of more, I called it like structural absurdity, or a generalized form of absurdity, where we talked about the way that the infinite and the finite, the contradiction between the two, that generates the absurd, and the manifestation of God in time, that for religiousness be, that's the absurd element in it. But as you can see with this example, the absurd appears in different ways in different cases, but it's always linked to God in some way, to religion, to faith. It always has that connection. So it always still involves an absolute relation to the absolute within the finite. So, and that's kind of the bedrock for that paradox, and different forms of absurdity manifest thereafter. So okay, there is a a kind of an extended discussion that Kierkegaard gives in Fear and Trembling about the teleological suspension of the ethical, which is worth looking at. So that's the gist of the story, the double movement, the move to infinite resignation, and you can stop there. You don't need to continue on to faith, but such a character is incapable of true joy. They've renounced. Yeah, I mean, that's it. That's the downside, isn't it? They're incapable of true joy. You can stop there, and it's possible to be kind of noble. There is a kind of a nobility in that. But if you want the joy, if you want to reconcile things in such a way that they, in a greater picture, then you need faith for that. So the discussion then, this teleological suspension of the ethical, this comes up a lot when you talk about Kierkegaard, and the idea is that, well, first of all, the individual has his or her telos, their end, ethically speaking, in the universal. So when we're talking ethics, one is aiming at these universal principles, right? Not at the kind of particular, the level of the particular, but aiming at these universal principles, or principles that are universalizable, be another way to say that. But Abraham here has acted unethically. There's no way that sacrificing your child can be seen as ethical. So he's contravened that. He's gone against that ethical mandate, if you like, or he's gone against the whole principle of ethics. So how can we justify this? Because that seems unjustifiable. So Kierkegaard says that the absurd in Abraham's relation to the ethical is that the single individual as a particular is higher than the universal. So remember that originally I just said the individual is subordinate to the universal. The individual aims at the universal in the ethical. That's what it means. That's what it means to be ethical. But Abraham has reversed this. So now the single individual, the particular, is higher than the universal, than the principle. And this is absurd. This is the absurdity in Abraham's relation to the ethical. But the individual achieves this, or Abraham has achieved this, by moving through the universal to stand in an absolute relation to the absolute. That's the key point. So it's not that he's abandoning the universal, he's gone through that. Remember that, so that this kind of, it connects with the three spheres: aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. So he's gone through that ethical sphere and come out in this higher sphere where there's an absolute relation to the absolute. And eventually we'll see that it's that absolute relation to the absolute that trumps, if you like, the ethical. So it's I'll come to that in a minute. So this paradox, anyway, the paradox that in going through the universal one comes to an inversion of it, if you like, a situation where the individual is higher than the universal. It's a paradox, and as a paradox can't be mediated or understood, Kierkegaard says. There's if it could be, it wouldn't be a paradox. It would be, or it would be like a relative paradox. So if Abraham, Kierkegaard talks about this, if Abraham had been willing to sacrifice his son for a higher expression of the ethical, for perhaps a greater good, then he would have joined the ranks of tragic heroes, and he mentions Agamemnon and Jephthah. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right from the Bible, but both of those two characters they murdered their children. Agamemnon did, I think, in order to help win a war, and Jephthah, again, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he said he sacrificed, he murdered, he killed his daughter, I think, in order to keep his promise, because for some bizarre reason he said he'll sacrifice, that's right, he'll sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house, something like that, if they win a particular battle or something. And the first thing that came out of his house was his daughter. So in order to keep his promise, so he's obeying a higher ethical, what the act itself, murdering or sacrificing your child, is not ethical, but there's a higher ethical standard that he's holding himself to, which is the keeping of his promise, which he made earlier. And the same with Agamemnon, in order to guarantee a greater ethical good, he sacrificed his daughter. And if that was what Abraham had done, he could be a tragic hero, but he wouldn't be a hero of faith. He wouldn't be a knight of faith. But anyway, there's no possible ethical justification for Abraham. He doesn't have that out. He was just prepared to do it because God told him to, basically. And Kierkegaard says in doing that, he stepped beyond the ethical, suspending it in relation to something higher. And this something higher was, as we all know, God. So essentially, the absolute duty to God can lead to what ethics would forbid, what would be forbidden in normal ethical theory. And that's the paradox. That's the absurdity of this. But Kierkegaard leaves it there. It's just a paradox, and you can't understand it. And this is something else about Kierkegaard, which is I don't know if it's good, or it is kind of good. He's not like, he's not like everything's going to work out for the best and you'll be happy. Can't believe in God and it's all wonderful and roses and cherries. So he says, existing in this paradox of faith, which is what faith is, a paradox. We've talked about that, the absurdity of faith. Existing in the paradox of faith is the most terrifying thing in the world, because one must renounce the universal in order to be the particular. So that inversion comes about, and that's why it's the most terrifying thing in the world. Hence the title, Fear and Trembling. This religion for Kierkegaard it's not like something you can undertake lightly. It's not something you do every Sunday and then you go back to work and live your normal life until a week later. It's not, nor is it something that once you decide to believe, or however you frame it, or once you join a church or whatever, that everything's nice and smooth and having a relationship with God is all roses and cherries. This is serious, and it's not something to be undertaken lightly, and it's hard. It's a paradox. There's a paradox at the heart of this, and it will require, like we said, this inversion where the ethical is no longer the absolute. The ethical is no longer the goal, or the highest standard. Now there's this other standard. And so anyway, that's kind of interesting the way he points that out. This is a terrifying endeavor. And he also says that faith can't be explained to anyone else. Language, reason, logic, all of these fail before the paradox. And so Abraham couldn't have explained what he was doing, why he was doing what he was doing, because there is no way to explain it. It's a paradox. It's absurd at its core. And the consequence of this is that no one can be assisted into faith, right? You can't, and this connects back to with what we talked about with the teacher and communication regarding the subjective and the objective. You can't help anyone else through anything. There's nothing you can do that could help someone to subjective truth. It's something that they have to experience themselves. They have to live it themselves. And because at the heart of it, there's a paradox. It's absurd. Okay, so what do we think about this? I've written one sentence here, not terribly impressed by this, which I think, yeah, there's a lot of stuff I like in Kierkegaard. This is not one of them. This is not one of the things I like. I mean, it's a little bit more sophisticated than you might get from, from your local church and a basic kind of Christian dogma. But essentially, Kierkegaard's just saying, you can't understand it. Abraham, if you're really trying to understand Abraham, it's inexplicable, right? No one can understand it. I've had this argument with people before. What he did was monstrous. What he was prepared to do was monstrous. There's no justification. And the fact that God stopped him before he did it doesn't pardon him, doesn't get him off the hook, Well, imagine if this happened to you. Your father was prepared to sacrifice you, had you strung up and everything, and was all ready with the knife, and then somehow God stops him from killing you and says you don't have to anymore. That's okay. I mean, how are you going to feel about that? Will you be like, oh, must be a paradox. I can't understand it. So everything's okay, Dad. I mean, what, right? And yeah, just to say that, well, just to kind of brush it away as it's a paradox and the absolute duty to God. That's all. I mean, all it really comes down to is you do what God says, and nothing else matters. Nothing else counts. So, not overly impressed with that story, but it does show the way that Kierkegaard uses the absurd here, the way that it appears in kind of a semi pseudo real life example. I mean, the only thing I would say maybe is the deck is stacked against Kierkegaard with this particular endeavor, right? He's trying to explain something that is basically inexplicable. You can't. It's just a story about doing God's will, right? Having faith, doing what God says, irrespective of anything else. That's what it comes down to. Anyway, so that's the way that the paradox and the absurd arises in Fear and Trembling. And he also talks about faith and a deeper, a kind of movement to a deeper level or a higher level in stages on life's way, and it concerns marriage. Alright, so the point with this, stages on life's way, I'm talking about the second essay, or the second part of stages, where the author is Judge William, the same judge from Either Or, and he's basically extending the discussion that he started in Either Or. So in Either Or, he's writing against Johannes, or A, maybe what have we just called A, who was the aesthete of the first part of Either Or, and he's giving kind of an ethical reason or ethical justification for marriage. So he's defending marriage as opposed to the immediacy of the erotic, which was what the first half of Either Or was about, or at least Johannes's The Diary of the Seducer. So, and in stages, the Judge William is carrying on that same discussion, but he's kind of lifting it from the ethical to the religious. So he's bringing in the element of faith, and we'll see how he does that right now. So anyway, marriage is, he says, a deeper expression of love than the erotic. And as an example of this, he says he doesn't appreciate his wife. This is Judge William talking. He doesn't appreciate his wife with aesthetic categories the way that a poet would. So he doesn't think about her in terms of her long, lustrous hair and her lovely complexion or her sparkling eyes or anything like that. Those are the way that those are the ways you would appreciate something in the aesthetic realm, right? Rather, he appreciates the eternal in his wife. And so the eternal here, by that he means the idea, the universal principle in his wife, which is to say that of perhaps femininity, or the universal principle maybe of motherhood, perhaps something. It's those kinds of things he sees in his wife. So this higher, I mean, that's an ethical position to take. So he appreciates that, the eternal in his wife, as well as the deeper religious element, which comes in through the resolution, which is an important word for Kierkegaard, and we'll look at what that means in just a moment. So, first of all, William says we need the immediate. We need the immediacy of the erotic. So this is the aesthetic. But again, without that, there is no love. So if you don't even have that, the immediacy that the erotic kind of brings to the table, there is no love at all. So you can't even get off the ground. And that, if you remember, reflects the way I said that these higher realms, the ethical and the religious, they don't annihilate, they don't eliminate the lower. They take it up, they lift it up to a higher expression. So he starts off by making that clear. We need the immediate, the immediacy of the aesthetic realm, or there's no love. But marriage is entered into by a resolution. And like I said, this is an important word for Kierkegaard with a specific meaning. And essentially it means it's a decision, but a strong decision. And we'll talk more about this a few videos later. But for now, let me just say that the resolution it's a commitment or a decision which includes the temporal and the eternal. And that's how William describes it in Stages on Life's Way, but we've been talking about that in terms of the finite and the infinite. So it's the same thing. There's that same bringing together of these two realms. I feel like I've used that too much, but bringing these two aspects together, and that's where the contradiction comes up. That's where we get these paradoxes and things. But anyway, that's the resolution. Is the way that we get into, is the way that marriage comes about. So it's always entered into by this resolution, which is a strong commitment that involves this, by necessity, lifts everything up into the realm of faith, the religious sphere. But resolution presupposes reflection. There's obviously some reflection involved in making a resolution, and reflection annihilates immediacy. So that's kind of a problem, right? We get into a marriage is entered into by resolution. Resolution presupposes reflection, and reflection destroys immediacy. But we just said that we need that immediacy. So how is it preserved? Well, Kierkegaard's answer is that the reflection doesn't target immediate love, the immediacy of the erotic itself, thereby eliminating it. Rather, which if it did, it would eliminate it. Rather, it focuses on the relation between the immediate love and actuality. So the reflection is it's not focused on the immediacy of the erotic, which would get rid of it. Now I'm just repeating myself. It's focused on the relation between the immediate love and actuality, which is marriage. So it's focused on, the reflection is focused on the element of marriage itself. And basically, what we're talking about here is making the immediate into something actual. So if you remember, the immediate in the aesthetic sphere is characterized by possibility. Right? It's dominated by possibility. And what we're trying to do here with marriage is make it that possible, that immediate eroticism, convert that into something concrete, something actual. And that's what the reflection is aimed at. It's not aimed at the erotic love itself. It's aimed at the relation which would the relation which is marriage, and which would lift the love from the immediate into the actual, to a higher sphere. So I've got a quote here. Let me read this. In this way, reflection is discharged into faith, which is precisely the anticipation of the ideal infinity as resolution. Thus, through the purely ideally exhausted reflection, the resolution has gained a new immediacy that corresponds exactly to the immediacy of falling in love. The resolution is a religious view of life constructed upon ethical presuppositions. So let's just have a quick look at this one. Reflection becomes faith through resolution, which basically makes the ideal infinite concrete. So it's with that we're raising the whole character of this discussion from out of the aesthetic into the ethical or the religious. And since we're talking about the ideal infinite here, necessarily it's kind of like infusing the concretion that's marriage with the religious or with the God idea. So like I said, this resolution brings faith into the equation because of what it is, because it's this synthesis of the temporal and the eternal, or it's the eternal manifesting within the temporal. So just the fact that we have that, the fact that it involves this resolution, necessarily lifts the love into the realm of the religious. So the second sentence there, through reflection, the resolution of marriage is a new immediacy corresponding to the immediacy of falling in love. You can see there that we've kind of come the full circle. We've gone through from the aesthetic, ethical, the religious, and now we've come out with almost that religiousness B, where we've got a new immediacy. It's redirected outside again towards that eternal, that infinite element. So there's that kind of connection. And if you don't want to go that far, there's still the element of the immediate is being preserved within the religious sphere. So even if we're not going quite as far as religiousness B, perhaps just religiousness A, the immediate is still encapsulated in that. And finally, the final sentence there, the resolution is a religious view of life constructed upon ethical presuppositions. Again, preserving that the universal, but just raising it, lifting it to the level of faith. So I hope that kind of makes sense. I did a lot of talking in that, and I hope it makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know. Tell me if there's anything I said that you think is crazy. Some of the stuff I'm just kind of winging it. I'm not winging it. It's all here, but I'm trying to make the pieces fit, and it's not always as easy as I remember it being when I'm writing these notes. So anyway, let me move on. The idea here with this is that in marriage, the individual is thrust into a relationship with God, and that's where Kierkegaard's going with everything, right? It's about getting that relationship with God, and specifically here he's talking about the way that marriage is a lifting up. It's which includes, it kind of carries the aesthetic with it to the ethical, and it carries the ethical up as well until you get to the level of faith. So I've got another quote. This will be the last quote for this video. In this way, the wonder of falling in love is taken up into the wonder of faith. The wonder of falling in love is taken up into a purely religious wonder. The absurdity of falling in love is taken up into a divine understanding with the absurdity of religiousness. And so he talks about the absurdity there, and I haven't talked about that, but in the first section of stages, it's called in vino veritas. That is in that section, a whole bunch of guys get together. They have a party, kind of a philosophical party, so it's not that kind of party, but they all talk about love, and the conclusion, or they all have this similar ideas, but they all think love is absurd. They all think it's kind of ridiculous, and they all struggle to understand it. And that's what Kierkegaard's saying. What this whole discussion comes on the heels of that, where these guys have all talked about how falling in love is crazy, and people can't say why they're in love, because if you give a reason, then what if the person you love loses that reason for some reason? Too many reasons in there. But what if the reason you love them disappears, or they grow out of it, or they lose it? Do you not love them anymore? So they have a whole bunch of these kinds of thoughts about love, and the idea, and that kind of unites them all, is that falling in love and love itself is absurd. And so they're all immediate, they're all aesthetes, they're all if they're going to go in for love, it's as a kind of casual erotic endeavor rather than a serious commitment. And that's the context in which Judge William is writing what we've just been talking about. So anyway, that absurdity is taken up into a divine setting, and infused with the absurdity that is the religious. And so there's the absurd was always going to feature in this in some way, as it always will whenever you're talking about faith, whenever you talk about religious, you're necessarily invoking paradox and the absurd. And so we can kind of contrast that with this discussion of love with the pure a pure kind of intellectuality, intellectualism. That's probably the better word. Pure intellectualism, which is an abstraction, and that completely lacks any religious idea. And that is to a certain extent the way that modernity thinks about love, or at least Kierkegaard criticizes his period, his time period, for the way that they've over-intellectualized love. They want to think, people want to think their way into love. They want to rationalize it. They want to choose their partner based on, whatever characteristics or traits. So there's that this kind of intellectual, rational, reflective endeavor has abandoned the aesthetic. So it hasn't taken it up, picked it up and carried it to the next level. It's it's an abstraction of love, and as such it's empty. It's hollow. There's nothing to it. So that's the second case study, and that's the last case study I wanted to cover. Let's have a quick look at a summary. So we looked at Fear and Trembling first, which was Abraham's sacrifice, and we saw that involved a double movement. The first movement being that of infinite resignation, where the desire is renounced infinitely. So the desire doesn't disappear, it hasn't been conquered, but it's been kind of, you've made your peace with existence, with the fact that you're not going to get it, you're not going to attain whatever it is, the desire. The second movement was faith, where we were believing on the strength of the absurd that what one has renounced will be given back. And that's because for God all things are possible. So that necessarily brings God into the picture. And we also looked at the teleological suspension of the ethical, which featured in that. And it's kind of just, I don't want to diminish Kierkegaard's ideas here, but in a way it's just saying absolute duty to God trumps everything else. I just can't see, essentially, I can't see it as being anything more than that. And the second kind of case study we looked at was marriage in stages on life's way, where we were raising the erotic to the religious, so raising the immediate to faith, and that happened through marriage. And the key point there was the marriage being a resolution, and resolution involves the finite and the infinite, or the eternal and the temporal, and that lifts the whole thing, the whole discussion, up to the religious plane. And the final point there was that the absurdity of falling in love, of erotic love, is taken up in the absurdity of religiousness. So again, paradox worked its way in. And so that's basically where I'm going to finish this video. The next video we'll move into will be the last concerning the three spheres, and it's the last religious, explicitly religious. Well, there's more religion coming later, but it's the last from this religious sphere of existence. We'll look at God and gratitude and wonder, and that far right side of the diagram, if you can remember what that looks like. I haven't shown it. Anyway, thanks for listening as always, and I will catch you for the next video.